We have seen it over and over and over again on the news. Allegations of excessive use of force by police, some very much publicized cases around the country. They're really, comparatively to the number of police on the streets across America and to the number of people who are committing violent acts or confronting police across America, I would say that it's really still a very small percentage of incidents nationwide of police having to use lethal force. But is there a way around even those situations? And to discuss that and more, Alex Del Carmen is our guest talking about teaching police de-escalation techniques. Alex, good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
Yeah, good to have you with us. So what I see, we have the highly publicized cases. We had a case here in Cincinnati, which is still, of course, being litigated, where we have an officer who was a UC police officer off campus pulling over a black suspect, Samuel DuBose. The officer says, and the first trial was a mistrial, the officer says that he tried to drag him, the suspect tried to drag him before he opened fire. Whether you believe that or not, really depends on which side of the ball you're on, law enforcement or the criminal element, or people who are, into Black Lives Matter, for example, and the like. It's a very well-publicized case. But really, are there that many people, considering the number of police officers on the street and the population, what are the percentages of people shot and killed by police?
It's a very small percentage. I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at how many times people die at the hands of, by the hands of police officers through the usage of a firearm, it's in the thousands in a year. And there are 1 million police officers in the streets every single day of America. So in contrast, I mean, it's a very small percentage. But that doesn't mean that we can't hold police accountable for what they do. And obviously, it doesn't mean that that most of these shootings are in fact illegitimate. When in reality, we know that for the most part, most police shootings are within the confines of the law, and police are doing what they're required to do. But from time to time, unfortunately, we find that police officers do things that they shouldn't do, and they in fact violate the civil rights of people.
Well, of those 1,000 people on average shot and killed by police in America every year, out of a population of 320 million, by the way, more than half had guns. And if there's a suspect with a gun, I mean, police officers are trained to, if they feel like their life or the life of someone else is in danger because someone's got a gun, they are trained to use deadly force, are they not? And should that be changed?
No, not at all. I mean, there's no question that police officers, when they find themselves to be under the gun, literally speaking, that somebody's life is being threatened, including their own, they have to sadly resort to lethal force, and they're trained to do that, and we should not, curtail their ability of doing that. As difficult as it may be for all of us to see the loss of life, at the end of the day, police officers have a very tough job, and we want them to come home safely, and we want the citizens to be protected. But what we are saying, however, is that there are instances when they do make mistakes, and there are other times when they deliberately do things that they shouldn't do. Now, in terms of percentages, it's a very, very small percentage within those small percentages, but we still have to train them so that at the end of the day, when they face a difficult situation, it becomes what we call in training a muscle reflex. In other words, it becomes automated, where it's almost automatically done.
Right. American Public Media investigation says that 34 states right now do not require law enforcement officers to learn de-escalation tactics to avoid shootings. So I don't know why there isn't more hue and cry for this around the country. And is it best left up to states or local municipalities? Because in some cities, there are different rules of engagements for different neighborhoods, are there not?
Right. So this is a very complicated issue, and I'm glad you're raising that in your show because it deserves to be talked about. So at the end of the day, every single state has to come up with their own rules and regulations as to what they require in terms of number of hours for a person to become a trained police officer. So here in Texas, for instance, we have X number of hundreds of hours that the person has to undergo and a test that they have to pass to become a police officer. But every city that officer works for, in every single city, in every single state, every city depicts what type of policies, what type of procedures, and therefore use of force parameters that police officer has to adhere to. So while they're trained under the same premise, every city requires a different standard. And by the way, so do the feds. The feds require a different standard than most municipalities.
Yeah, Dallas Police Department saw an 18% drop in use of force the year after it instituted de-escalation training there. Since 2010, excessive force complaints have dropped there by 83%. Now, that's pretty remarkable. But you've also seen departments implementing this de-escalating training, like New York, Chicago, which to me that's a big red flag under Chicago, because while some of the departments have reported reductions in use of force incidents, in Chicago, where they've implemented this de-escalation training, I don't know how far-reaching it is, but we have seen the murder rate and the shooting rate in the city of Chicago go way up because police seem less willing to engage. Your comments on that?
Right. That's right. So it's a catch-22. So we don't want to make police officers shy of having to use force and sometimes even lethal force if they need to. But at the same time, we want them to understand that they just can't shoot people because they think that person holds a gun when in fact it's a cell phone, or they may in fact, I mean, we had an incident here in the Dallas area a couple of weeks ago in one of the cities right outside Dallas where a police officer shot and killed a young man that was just in his car driving out of a driveway. I mean, officers were dispatched to the scene. They saw this car pull out, and the officer just picked up his gun and essentially shot and killed this person. The officer was subsequently charged with murder a few days ago. It's hit national media, recently. But we do see incidents like that, but they're far in between the thousands of contacts that they have. But we have to train officers, and de-escalation training is incredibly important. We have to train them how to essentially de-escalate from resorting to their gun as their primary source of engagement with the public.
Well, wouldn't you say, though, Alex Del Carmen, that if a police officer is on the scene of a situation and there is someone who is wielding a knife and charging at that officer and ignores the communicated pleas by that officer to stop, and he's charging him with a knife, the officer is left with very little other recourse? I know it's a knife, not a gun, but still, I mean, a knife can be a deadly weapon. A car can be a deadly weapon when an officer's called on the scene, and these people are making these decisions in split seconds.
Absolutely, and of course it's lethal force, and that officer is thinking, I want to go home, and I want to go home safely, and I want to make sure everybody else does as well. So yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting at all that the officer should essentially back off and get back in his car and call for backup while the other guy is pulling the gun out of the officer. But what I am saying, though, is that there are levels of use of force that have to be met, right? So if the officer, for instance, in that one example that you gave, has enough distance between the bad guy coming with a knife and the officer, you could pull out a taser. And simply disable the person. If that doesn't work, then the gun, it will be the last resort. So you do have options in how you escalate on use of force when that happens. But again, you and I are sitting here talking about this in the calmness of today.
Yeah.
But if we were faced with this stuff, I mean, this is a matter of seconds. Those police officers have to respond almost instinctively to whatever they face. And that's what people don't understand, is that at the end of the day, you're there, it's happening all at once, and in a matter of seconds, they have to respond.
So what kind of de-escalation tactics are we talking about as far as its training?
So essentially what de-escalation means is that we train police officers, and I've actually trained thousands of officers on some of these techniques, but essentially what happens is you engage in use of force. Use of force can mean a lot of different things. For instance, the officer could use pressure points to disable a person. In the military, we call that hand-to-hand combat.
Sure.
You could also turn around and use a taser, use a baton, use a barrier between you and the bad guy. And at the end of the day, the most ultimate of all use of force sources is in fact a gun, or a shotgun or a rifle that officer would have. So the idea is that you meet force with force, that you overwhelm the suspect with force in order to neutralize the threat, but at the same time, your first resort, the first thing that you go for is not the gun, because there are instances where people come in with a trash can, and obviously, in examples such as those, you wouldn't necessarily have to draw your gun and kill that person, whereas you would have had 3 or 4 other options on instruments that you could use to disable the threat and not necessarily kill the person.
Well, thankfully, again, Alex, while these are all things that should be considered and perhaps implemented in certain areas around the country on a state-by-state basis, or as they're doing now with municipalities, individual municipalities, understand, too, that there is a majority of police officers, and I've talked to many of them, who are on the force for 30, 35, 40 years and never pulled their service weapon at any time during their entire career, and it's the last thing an officer wants to do generally. There are rogue people in every walk of life, and certainly there are some bad eggs in the police departments around the country, here and there. It happens. It's human nature, and it's by the law of averages. It's going to happen. But the last thing an officer wants to have to do, on average, is even pull his weapon, because they're trained if they pull their weapon, they need to be prepared to use their weapon in an instantaneous situation. But just the paperwork alone is daunting, and while we're talking about human lives, but it does come down to situations like where the police go, I don't want to fill out these 5s. I don't want to be suspended for a week while they investigate this. I don't want to put my career in jeopardy, or my freedom. So I think it's important people understand that while we're discussing these issues.
There's no question, and we also teach police officers verbal commands, on how to use them. We call it verbal judo. The idea that police officers can engage somebody verbally and disable that person with commands and being able to exert their authority. So yeah, there are 1,000 options, and you're right. I mean, it's a great point that you're making, that it's just a very few instances where these things happen, and like every profession, we have the bad apples. The problem with law enforcement, in the sense that, what happens if we only have 1 out of every, say, 15 or 20,000 police officers that may in fact be in this category of not being ideal for the job, is that they, in fact, we've given them the authority to take somebody's life. And so by virtue of that, we have to make sure that we get it right most, if not all of the time, as opposed to sometimes.
Alex Del Carmen, thank you very much. Good stuff, and lots of interesting and important things to think about. I appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks for having me.
All right, you bet. Gary, Jeff, and Frisloni back with your phone calls and more. 513-749-7000, 1-800-843-2441.